keynote speech and keynote speaker will be Dr. Keith Lowe, our long-time friend. Keith Lowe is an author of several major works of history. He is best known for his book, Savage Continent, which became an international bestseller and went on to win both the Hassel-Tillman Prize for History and Italy's National Caresco History Prize. It is now a standard work on the wave of violence and revenge that swept Europe after the Second World War. Association Non-Fiction Crown, it was shortlisted for the Historical Writers Association Non-Fiction Crown and has been adopted as 12-part radio series in Czech Republic. Keith also written critically acclaimed books on Second World War monuments titled Prisoners of History and the bombing of Hamburg in 1943. His latest work, Naples 1944, describes the liberation of Italy and the political and economic chaos that followed. We first met in 2013 in Berlin during the second European Memory Symposium, which took place in the great German capital, and we invited him also as a keynote speaker at that time. Since then, we have collaborated many times, and Keith became a friend. Keith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Raphael. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is an honor to be standing here before you today on this wonderful occasion of the 20th anniversary, the 20th birthday of ENRS. I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. I fully support everything that you do. And more than that, I support the spirit in which you do it. Because history is not an easy subject, especially the history of the 20th century. There's so much pain and trauma involved, so many delusions of grandeur as well, that it's easy to learn the wrong lessons of history and to fall once again into its traps. And of course, history is political. I mean, here we are in Poland, we have a new president who's a historian. History and politics, they go together, whether we like it or not. They're entwined with one another. Now, I know that ENRS was founded with the idea of trying to take some of the politics out of history, or at least to try and direct it towards reconciliation rather than division. 20 years ago, there was plenty of division. Back then, memory of life under communism was still very fresh. But there were other, older resentments as well, which had lain dormant ever since 1945. There were the horrors of war, of course, but also the violence and the injustice which came afterwards. The border changes that were imposed upon Eastern Europe, the forced expulsion of millions of people, mostly German speakers, but also other minorities, revenge, violence, the exploitation of women. I mean, all of these things had remained kind of unacknowledged for decades because the Iron Curtain had made it impossible to speak about them openly. Now, the politicians of that time, politicians from Germany and Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Austria, Czechia, they could have tried to just ignore these problems, bury them, hope that they'd just go away. Or they could have exploited them, They could have stoked up resentment and, against their neighbors and ridden on that horse waving a flag. But instead, they decided to do something far more difficult, far more courageous. They decided to talk. They decided to create a space where everybody could air their grievances openly and honestly, but with respect for other people's points of view. And the creation of ENRS, European Network, Resistance and Solidarity, was central to that process. It was created in 2005 with the express purpose of opening up all of this difficult history together, in conversation with one another, to learn from one another, to empathize with one another. And that's not an easy thing to do. I want to tell you a story now of something which demonstrates all of, some of the difficulties of opening up this kind of history. It's a story that some people might be familiar with because I've written about it before in one of my books, but it bears repeating now because it's about this intersection between history and politics. A few years ago, I was invited to Slovenia. The government there was about to, they were presenting the design for a new memorial they were building in Ljubljana. And to my great delight, they invited me along to attend the sort of ceremony they were going to have. So I went along to Ljubljana. I sat in the parliament. I watched as the president made his speech, as he unveiled this design. And then, of course, they had a reception, a bit like we're going to have tonight. Now, in my naivety, I thought that this reception would be a very happy, jolly affair. Everybody would have a glass of wine. Everybody would congratulate themselves on a job well done. But actually, it wasn't jolly at all, this reception. There was actually something really quite uncomfortable about it, that I'm an outsider. I didn't really understand what was going on. I should probably say a little bit about this monument, because that's part of the reason why things were uncomfortable. It had a very abstract design. It consisted of two slabs of stone sticking out of the ground. I think they were supposed to represent two enemies. So they were sort of standing close together but not quite touching. They were standing opposite but not quite opposite. That kind of thing, sort of abstract ideas. Now, nobody at that reception liked this monument at all. It was too abstract, they said. It wasn't satisfying as a memorial. It didn't say anything about heroes or villains or the victims of the war. It was too bland, they said, too unemotional. None of them could quite explain exactly what it was they didn't like, but they all seemed to feel the same. And it was at that point that a Slovenian historian who was also at this reception came and found me and said, "Let me show you why nobody likes this memorial. Let me take you to a place which explains why we can only have bland, unemotional monuments here in Slovenia." So he got in his car and we drove out of the city. We drove east through these beautiful rolling hills. We had the Alps on our left and the River Sava on our right. After an hour or two, we turned off the main road and we went up this narrow little track through the forest. We drove up through the forest and eventually we came to the side of the mountain. And there, in the side of the mountain, there was this giant concrete doorway with an iron door on the front of it. And this is where we stopped the car and got out. Now, Ferenc explained to me what this place was. He said, at the beginning of the 20th century, this place had been a coal mine. But in 1945, it became a mass grave. In the last days of the war, the German army, of course, they've been retreating from Yugoslavia Tito had declared a new communist order in the country, and his army rounded up tens of thousands of fascist collaborators and massacred them. There are massacre sites all over Slovenia. I've been to lots of them. And this was one of those sites. Apparently, 2,500 people had been brought to this mine where they had been shot and then thrown down the mine shafts. And then the mine was sealed up. And I mean, it was comprehensively sealed up. Mitja Ferenc was on the government team which came to exhume this place. He said that they'd filled it with tons of earth and rubble, then they built a brick wall and another brick wall, a concrete barrier, another brick wall. I mean, they really wanted to seal this place up. It took Mitja 7 months just to dig his way through all these barriers to get to the tunnels behind. So anyway, there I am, I'm standing there outside this sort of gateway to the underworld with this historian, my very own private Virgil, or Vergilius, I think you call him in Polish. He calls up the caretaker, who came and unlocked the gate for us, and we went inside. First of all, we walked down a long, dark tunnel deep into the mountainsides. It was about 400 meters into the darkness. At one point, Mitja stopped and he pointed to this hollow in the wall. "This is where we found the first body," he said. Because apparently somebody had survived this massacre and was trying to tunnel his way back out again. He'd ripped up a piece of metal from the railway track and was using it to dig. And actually he'd got quite far, but then he'd come up against the first concrete barrier and he couldn't get any further. So that was where he'd died. We carried on until we got to a mine shaft. Mitja made me climb down to the bottom of the pit and stand where all the bodies had been thrown. And then he called down to me, he said, "They filled this shaft to the top with corpses. We pulled out 346 bodies. There are probably another 2,000 people still down there beneath your feet." I have to say, standing at the bottom of this pit alone was a uniquely disturbing feeling. And I looked up and I thought, you know, Mitja could very easily just abandon me here. Could go out of the tunnel, turn the lights off, close the gates, and then what could I do? So I quickly climbed back up the ladder. Next, he took me deeper into the tunnel, where another 432 bodies had been found. They had been made to undress and lie flat on the floor of the tunnel and had been shot in the back of the head. And then the next group had been brought in and made to lie down on top of them, and then they too had been shot. And then the next group, and the next, and the next, until the bodies were stacked 8 high. Finally, he took me to another part of the tunnel where there was another metal door. He unlocked it and led me inside. "Here they are," he said. And before me, there were hundreds and hundreds of plastic crates lined up on both sides of the tunnel. Sticking out of these crates were bones and skulls and bits of human hair. It was really quite shocking to see the remains of human beings like this, stacked up in plastic crates. We wanted to give them a proper burial, Mitja told me, but none of our politicians was willing to do it. These people were, of course, they were victims of the communists, sure, but they had themselves been fascists. So nobody wanted to make some kind of shrine to them. It was difficult to know how to remember them at all. So in the end, they just locked the doors and tried to forget about them. Nobody has been to visit this place since we first exhumed it, Mitja told me, 7 years before. In all that 7 years, only a handful of people had bothered to come and see it for themselves. Just me, the US ambassador, and a handful of journalists. It was like a guilty memory Everybody knew that it was there, but nobody wanted to properly acknowledge it. Now that night, in my hotel room, I had nightmares about what I'd seen. It was not so much the dead bodies that bothered me, that kept me awake. I'm not squeamish like that. It was the thought of that man who had survived the massacre and tried to dig his way out. Imagine what it must have been like for him, stepping out of the pit in the darkness, finding a piece of metal, and desperately trying to dig your way out. There's something really quite heroic about it, isn't there? But in the end, this man wasn't a hero. He was a victim. And perhaps not only a victim, perhaps also a perpetrator. He was a fascist after all, and a soldier. Perhaps he too had committed atrocities of his own. It's impossible to know how to feel about him. And this was why that war memorial in Ljubljana was so abstract. Partly because the reality is just too brutal to show, but also because, it's difficult to encapsulate all of these different ideas in a single image. It was also why the atmosphere in that reception of politicians was so uncomfortable. Because how can you remember a past like this without feeling uncomfortable? There are no heroes in this story. There's just a dark hole filled with corpses. Now, every nation in Europe has these dark places in its history. The Ardeatina caves in Rome, Lidice in the Czech Republic, Orador, Distomo, Katyn, Babi Yar. It goes on and on and on throughout the war and after the war as well. Lambsdorff, Kielce, Zawadzka Morakowska. It just goes on. I am lucky because I come from a country which was never invaded during the Second World War. We had no Einsatzgruppen rounding up Jews in Britain. There was no NKVD. There's no House of Terror in London. And yet we too have our guilty memories. We Brits like to think of ourselves as the big heroes of the war, but we committed crimes. Our bombing war killed hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. Not only in Germany either, in France, in the Netherlands. These are countries that we were supposed to be liberating. Now make no mistake, this was a war crime, even by the standards of the time. And yet, what else could we do? We were at war. And whether we like it or not, war makes perpetrators of us all. So what do we do with these dark memories, these dark holes in our history? Do we simply try to forget them? Do we try to leave the corpses hidden away? Well, the problem with that is that, as any psychologist will tell you, a dark past does not like to stay buried. There will always be some part of the past that tries to tunnel its way back up to the surface, a bit like that survivor in the Slovenian mine. And even when there are no survivors, the past will come out, one way or another. There will always be witnesses. There will always be those who suspect what happened. And this mine in Slovenia is a case in point. The people who lived around that mine saw hundreds of prisoners going into the tunnel and not coming out again. They saw the tunnel being comprehensively blocked up with all this rubble and so on. They may have spoken about it only in whispers, but they still spoke about it. For 60 years, that mine remained closed, and in the absence of any hard facts, all kinds of rumors and exaggerations abounded about what lay behind that door on the side of the mountain. Or sometimes, the opposite occurred. Sometimes people denied that anything had happened at all. And again, in the absence of hard facts, it was easy to dismiss the subject as just a conspiracy theory, figment of the imagination. This is why history is so important. It's an academic discipline that refuses to ignore the past. It's a discipline which doesn't rely on popular memory, which, as we all know, is not reliable, but it insists on establishing the facts, no matter how difficult or unpalatable they might be. So history is is an antidote to wild rumor, and it is an antidote to denial. A historian's job is to dig through all the dirt and to get to the bones that lie beneath it. Then he or she has to separate those bones, stack them up in crates, and label them for all the world to see. For Mitya Ferenc, this is quite literally what he had to do. But for the rest of us, it is, at the very least, an excellent metaphor. Remembering events like this is not easy. There's so much pain, there's so much trauma, so much blame which gets attached. It's really tempting to get carried away with the emotion of it all and start to use history as a weapon, a bit like Putin does, a bit like so many populist politicians do all over the world. And this is why we need organizations like ENRS. We need forums where we can talk about our most difficult memories openly, honestly, without fear and without judgment. Sometimes I think the study of history, but particularly the history of the 20th century, is a bit like entering Dante's Inferno. Sometimes you need a guide, a Virgil, a Virgilius, to lead you through to safety on the other side. And ENRS plays that role. So I would like to thank you. I would like to thank you individually and collectively. You have been the guide for a whole generation of school children, of students, of teachers, and professional historians like me. You bring people together to share ideas, to share memories, even difficult memories. In fact, especially difficult memories. And in the world that we live in today, that is an act of real bravery. So once again, I want to thank you and congratulate you from the bottom of my heart, and may you continue your excellent work for another 20 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Keith, for those moving words. There are many spaces, many doors to be opened, many discussions to be led. Now, at the end of this part of the meeting, we would like to show you a short 30 seconds film to show you, like in a lens, our attitude to history, to memory, and to our work.